And so Pizzagate is this conspiracy theory that took hold probably in late October, early November 2016, which alleged that Hillary Clinton, along with other operatives of the Democratic National Committee, were using a pizza parlor in Northwest Washington, D.C. As part of a human trafficking ring that trafficked in children for satanic, pedophilic, cannibalistic ritual. And as the narrative developed, the realization was that they must be eating these children's hearts as a way to gain either great power or immortality. And the the glue that held all of this together was the interpretation of the WikiLeaks dump of the hacked DNC emails that included such um, incriminating evidence as "Do you like pizza?" and "I think you may have left a handkerchief behind," and phrases like that. So we were interested in the narrative framework that was generating the posts that were what we could observe in the social media surrounding what became known as Pizzagate. And this had real world consequences because by December of that year, somebody had gotten so upset that nobody was, quote, investigating this, that he grabbed his AR-15, his civilian version of a military rifle, jumped in his pickup truck, and drove through the night from North Carolina to Washington, D.C., and burst into the restaurant mid-afternoon and fired several shots to get people's attention so that they would bring him to the hidden door to the underground tunnels leading to the basement. Of course, Comet Ping Pong is built on concrete slabs, so there was no basement to investigate, and then he surrendered to the police outside. So that was the conspiracy theory, and I think our initial goals were just to see from the observed data that we had access to. One of the great things about the social media is that it really has become the world's largest self-archiving folklore collection, where folklore is sort of informal cultural expression circulating on and across social networks. So if we think of it that way, as something that has, characterized human societies for millennia, probably, then these online social media sites present a perfect opportunity to see kind of the self-archived expressions of people engaged in this type of informal cultural expression. One of the things people do is tell stories as a way to understand the environment in which they live. So you've got this Pizzagate thing. It went incredibly viral, as they say, in the run up to the November elections in 2016. And this goes way back to 2013, and Christie's staff, they orchestrated a political payback operation against a Democratic mayor of a little town called Fort Lee, New Jersey, which had as its most defining characteristic in this context was an on and off ramp to the George Washington Bridge, the most trafficked bridge perhaps in the world, leading into Manhattan. And they orchestrated a traffic jam, not just for a few hours, but for an entire week, because Mark Sokolich, the mayor of this town, didn't want to endorse Chris Christie. Now, Chris Christie in 2016 was kind of maneuvering, jockeying for position to become part of the Trump inner circle, part of the cabinet or something like that. And Bridgegate had been kind of bumping along with little drips and drabs of information coming out about what was an actual conspiracy, right? People trying to hide malign activity that had a very specific end goal, right? So there's a very specific end goal of Bridgegate. Make Mark Sokolich look bad. That was the goal. So what we found was we had a perfect set of narratives. One was a conspiracy theory, whereas Bridgegate was really a documentable political payback operation. And then one other very important key ingredient was the New York Times had drawn power relationship graphs, sort of based on the art of Mark Lombardi, who had spent his artistic career drawing these power graphs by hand. But the New York Times had also drawn these by hand for both Pizzagate and Bridgegate, and so that gave us evaluative material outside of what we were studying, right? So we had something to compare against, which in the humanities and social sciences is often very hard to find.
What were the differences between the way those two narratives were structured? Because that was the focus, if I understand it correctly, of your research, right?
The question I always ask myself is called the aliens-human problem. If the aliens would hack the internet, how much of human knowledge can they reverse engineer from it without having to abduct humans, right? So what that means computationally is like studying the text, the image, everything on the internet, and then doing what's called unsupervised, kind of mostly unsupervised learning, looking for patterns that already exist, right? And then create a structure. Tim, who has been already doing computational
folkloristics, yeah.
Computational folkloristic, right? Where he has been taking folklores and organizing them using computational tools. And those folklores and narratives have a structure, mostly expressed by like actors and actants. That is, there are people, groups of people and individuals who are interacting, right? And negotiating a pattern, right? And so the question was from the news and the social media. See, most of the formation of the narrative about Pizzagate happened on social media, like Reddit and 4chan and 8chan, this kind of no longer really fringe. It used to be fringe, right? So we had crawl up that data. And Bridgegate was mostly reported in by journalists in newspapers. So we analyzed that data for structure. So our model was like what a narrative should look like, which came from a huge literature on narrative theory. It's like almost a computational model. And this is work from before, a major breakthrough in artificial intelligence or anything like that. And now the question was, can we take that model, which came from narrative theory, and make it computational? That is, find the different actors, actants, and how they interact, which is like, for the lack of a better word, I call like the jigsaw puzzle fitting, right? Because in a particular post, which is what we get in social media, the whole narrative is not there. It's like there is an underlying growing, consensus-driven narrative that's happening. So what we have access are these millions, isolated posts. And now it's our thesis being that it's driven by an underlying, emerging narrative. So our goal is to kind of reverse engineer, that is, from these posts, can I distill out this narrative dynamic that's giving rise to these posts? So this is a famous problem in machine learning, in artificial intelligence. That is, there is a hidden model, right, that we don't see, but we see the output of that model, right? And then can I go ahead and estimate this hidden generative model, so as to say. And we were able to get that structure, derive a structure. And as Tim said, now we have two different structures. One, what's being revealed, right, from the Bridgegate, and what was kind of made up, behind the Pizzagate. So one would think that there would be a difference in the structure, right? And that's what we found, that in the Pizzagate case, right, there were these existing domains. There was this domain of politics, like Bill Clinton, Hillary Clinton, and her relationship to the Democratic National Party. And then there was this existing conspiracy theory, which was already there, that there is this whole cabal of elitist, powerful people who have a whole underground network of tunnels where they have children. So you can see these, these kind of fairly, some of them are overlapping, some of them are distinct, right? Groups. But then with the WikiLeaks, there was this reference that apparently John Podesta, had pizza at this Comet pizza place, right? And there was a handkerchief on which he was writing something. And someone took that, leap of faith that, oh, that connects everything, So suddenly this distinct group, right, where of a diner and the existing conspiracy theory, right, of like a cabal of children abusing politicians and elitists, this group, they all got connected based on the secret kind of knowledge, right, of the WikiLeaks. So there is no rhyme and reason. So what happens is if you just clip a few of these connections in the narrative, then it just falls apart. Whereas in the case of the Bridgegate, right, the network is very solid, right? And it was more like connecting people that were already connected. They were already working together. New Jersey politics and officials at the Port Authority, which controls the freeways, the bridge leading into Manhattan, and they have always been doing business with each other.
It was almost like they were hiding in plain sight, right? So the network structure of Bridgegate is really robust. But with the conspiracy theories, as Vwani points out, that there's just small number of snips or deletions you can make, and it all falls back apart. And people are like, oh, well, then we should just target those, areas to delete if we want to get rid of the conspiracy theory. The problem is the conspiracy theory is a little bit like Terminator 2, where, you shoot Arnold Schwarzenegger and he turns into, or whatever the Terminator is. You shoot him and he sort of dissolves into a puddle and then he immediately pulls back together. So because they're so easy to break apart, they're also really easy to put back together. With the COVID-19 work, we did see that conspiracies were forming, and then they were getting aligned narratively by people working out the contours of their understanding of what was happening in the pandemic. And then, of course, the one conspiracy theory to rule them all, sort of QAnon, came in like a vacuum cleaner and started hoovering up the different domains and aligning them. And one of the core parts of QAnon, of course, is the Pizzagate conspiracy theory, which lies at the very root of it.
These are like narratives that keep connected. They're existing narratives. So if we have a prior, like this whole cabal of politicians and elites trafficking in child abuse, right? Now, that got connected here, right? Suddenly. And it happens like overnight almost. So there is a competition going on in these, media sites, social media sites. People are constantly proposing new connections and nobody controls it, right? So it's like an emerging decision. Everybody wants to believe in some connection, but which connection is not very predictable. Right? So a recent event, a current event happens, right? And then QAnon posts this, whatever, it's like an oracle. It posts something. And then there are interpreters like priests who would then interpret it in the context of current events, right? And one of them or a couple of them would win, So there is a competition, it's a consensus driven process, right? And then suddenly one or two of these connections stick, and then you have a new conspiracy theory.
It also makes it a game. It makes it incredibly fun when these QAnon people have been talked to about why are you doing this. Like, well, it's really fun, right? It's really fun to feel that you're helping, explode or discover or quote research, and then it becomes this negotiated process that is ongoing, right? So there's no kind of there's only a snapshot in time of how these things look, and then they evolve over time. And that, of course, is where the COVID-19 stuff has become so interesting, because we've got a whole time frame for this, and it's all excruciatingly well documented in Reddit and 4chan and 8kun and you name your favorite social media site. These sort of linked narrative domains could lead to quite violent action, like we saw with even the witch hunts in 16th and 17th century Europe, where it was a series of linked narratives that eventually created a target, and the target of opportunity there was marginalized women in these communities, and that led to really quite horrific actions. Certainly one of the things that underlies a lot of this is that people do have very real fears, and they do have very real concerns. And this is what we use storytelling to address, right? So a lot of times stories are quite simple. They really are the Ghostbusters question, when ghosts appear in the neighborhood, who are you going to call? So this is, and the answer to that is clearly ideological, right? So the fears might be related to, well, I'm worried about, my children's future. Well, what is the most extreme version of that narratively, right? And then what are we going to do about it? And then the conspiracy theory kind of locks off a lot of the places that you might turn. So if we look at something quite classical like the stories of witches, it's sort of like, oh, well, witches are hurting our farm, they're hurting our economy. I'll go to the minister. Well, it turns out the minister's wife is a handmaiden of Satan, right? It's like, oh, well, I'll go to the person who owns the farm. Well, it turns out the person who owns the farm got his land from a pact with the devil, and so on and so forth. So everywhere where you turn, your possibilities for some solution to this grave threat to either your physical well-being, your future, or your economic well-being, your social well-being are blocked off narratively by these walls. And so one of the things that happens in times of either low access to information or low trust in information, or a combination of both. And weirdly, with the rise of the explosion of the internet, we've actually now come into this situation of low trust in information. Even though there's huge amounts of information there, there's no clear hierarchy of information, and there's been stories to undermine trust. So people then turn to storytelling, and so as Vwani points out, it's this collaborative process, this negotiated process of what are the threats, what can we do about it, and then it turns out that the things that you could do about it are threatening in and of themselves. People looking for explanations and searching them out narratively with their friends. I mean, it's one of the things we often do, right? Whenever we're looking for information or recommendations, we turn to the people that we trust. And same thing happens here with these storytelling environments. So I think that's how you wind up with thousands of people converging on the U.S. Capitol, and hundreds of them breaking in, right? Because that was the obvious answer to what are you going to do about this, right? Some sort of satanic elite has stolen the election and is undermining democracy. What are you going to do about it? Well, let's go take it back or stop the steal or whatever.
I think we were used to think of conspiracy theories more as ways people tend to give themselves a kind of weird peace of mind because it gives an answer to everything, even if it's a terrifying answer, but it's an answer. But the way you put it, it's really, it has a practical goal. Conspiracy theories are meant to turn into action. It's not just an unintended consequence, right?
Yeah, it's redolent of rumor, right? So I spent a lot of my career looking at legend and rumor, where legend is sort of a retrospective look at some sort of threat narrative, right? There's some sort of threat or disruption, then there's some strategy that is explored in the story, and then there's some result, right? So you wind up at the point of result. What happened when I applied that strategy to that problem? It's sort of like the Exorcist movie, right? If you remember, the little girl is possessed by Satan. The first thing mom does when she comes down the stairs spitting blood and with her head spinning around is she gives her, Tylenol or aspirin. And of course, that doesn't work against Satan. They do some antibiotics. That doesn't work. They go to the psychiatrist. And finally, they reach, some strategy, which is, find a Catholic priest trained in exorcism. And that finally works, right? And the family is restored and happy ending, right? So you can circle through these strategies. What rumor does, and we see this, actually, one of our students many years ago was looking at the unrest in Iran, and there were various things that would come out on an Iranian social media platform that would say things like, "Oh, there are tanks on the street of Tehran," and it stops there, right? So it presents the threat, and then it pushes it back into almost a consensus environment where the question is implicit: what are you going to do about it, right? So this has happened. What are you going to do about it, or what are we going to do about it, right? And so as soon as you push it into that realm of what are we going to do about it, people can very rapidly discuss this, settle on an action, and then actually take that action in the real world. And so that's where this becomes the spillover into real world action is something that a lot of people had said, oh, well, why worry about this? This is just happening online. But now we have multiple examples of there being a clear reason to worry about it, because people take real world action on the storytelling that they negotiate online. And social media has the reinforcement mechanism of kind of this role play thing, right? Where, once you start photographing yourself as a, freedom fighter or whatever other thing, holding various things like guns or something like that, well, then it's not a large step to go out of the sort of the role play on social media in real life, right? And then fill that role. So this goes kind of back to even classical sociological theory like Irving Goffman's, presentation of self in everyday life, and the impact that has actually on the way you perceive yourself as well. And then you take actions based on how you perceive yourself.
As a scholar of folklore, is that connection between narratives and action something you were already familiar with?
Yeah, this was, for me, it was one of these complete aha moments when I started talking with Vwani and discovering that some of these folklore theories could actually be operationalized and then tested on real world data and huge amounts of data. But already in folklore, we had been looking at belief systems, cultural ideological systems, and the idea of kind of dehumanization of other groups, outgroups, through storytelling. And once you've dehumanized another group, you can take all sorts of actions against them, up to and including genocide. So if we think about the radio transmissions during the Rwanda genocide, they were all basically telling stories accusing Group A or Group B of horrific actions. If we go to some of the most dark periods of the 20th century in the world, we'll find that there are a lot of dehumanizing stories that circulate and become part of the sort of the belief framework of the inside group that then takes action on some other group. This has just been a touchstone of human history, that we construct other groups through narrative And because that becomes fundamental to the way we perceive these other groups, it justifies a huge range of actions, including things like slavery, torture, even things that are, far less, horrific, but are part of the violence of everyday life. Microaggressions towards other groups and things like that are often predicated on stereotypes, and stereotypes come from storytelling.
A point you make in the article you both co-authored on COVID-19 conspiracies is that news and social media become more closely intertwined.
There's an acceleration as more access to social media becomes, immediate. That is to say, cell phones become better, right? Smartphones become better. So people are constantly engaging in this interaction with the social media. At the same time as we've got a diffusion of journalistic resources. So the journalists are also tightly tied to the social media ecosystem, right? So that journalists as well are not only tweeting, but also seeing what's happening on Twitter, just to use one example. And so that informs their reporting. So something that was, kind of distant at one point, something like storytelling about COVID-19 and it's part of a bioweapons program, or is a hoax or something like that, which is not really reported on at the beginning of the pandemic, becomes such a constant on the social media realm that it starts to feed into the reporting on COVID. And then, of course, things that are reported get picked up immediately in the social media ecosystem, so that the distinction between the news and the social media ecosystem starts to collapse. So I do think that COVID-19, because of the lack of clear information, right? Nobody knew what the hell this thing was, greatly increased the degree to which people globally were asking each other what the heck is going on. And because of the tight connection then to the journalistic ecosystem as well, it got picked up. And so things that were considered not worth reporting on rapidly moved to being part of the reporting itself. You can't necessarily disentangle where the signal is coming from initially. Is it coming from the media, the journalistic media, or is it coming from the social media, or is it some mutually constitutive process? So that's clearly a place to put some effort and look into in greater detail.
If you look at how most of the news outlets nowadays write their articles, it's quite amazing. The journalist or the reporter who is writing an article has a dashboard with where is it appear on a Google search? Like, is it in the first page or not? Your article. So you get rewarded. So it's a constant feedback signal from the social media. How many retweets did it get, right? Did it go viral? So when the feedback mechanism is closely tied to, social media, so your worthiness as a reporter gets judged by how much resonance it had in this social media sphere. And that's constant, almost real-time feedback to the reporters. So, what do you expect? And like the way I like to think about, see, this whole artificial intelligence or machine learning, why is it so much in the news, right? Partly because this scale of the internet, right, and the speed at which internet works, no human can make sense of it. So you need a mediator, right? You need like these clicks and the likes, right, for humans to make sense. So without this mediator of a machine, which is constantly looking out for you, right? And summarizing this vast scale of the internet as well as its nanosecond working speed, right? You don't have a way of interacting with this huge mass. And so when we talk about the social media, you have to talk about these measurement tools, right? These monitoring tools, which goes by the, the larger term of artificial intelligence or machine learning, because without that, you cannot make sense what's going on, And because of that, you think you can make sense of what's going on because it gives you constant feedback. And so it's a perfect storm, so as to say, it's like a positive feedback cycle that has found, in our term is called resonance. So it's like a perfect resonance with the human, mind, and it has been built that way.
In some ways, that resonant frequency is also inherent in stories, right? It's millions of years of human evolution that stories are unbelievably efficient at conveying some kernel of cultural ideology. It's people always used to ask me, early on in my career, why are you studying stories? I was like, because I think they're really important to the way we, as humans, interact with the world. They're unbelievably efficient vehicles. And we're all very good at this. We're all very, very good at creating these incredibly efficient vehicles for driving behavior, right? Because we're social animals and we want behavior to be aligned. If our behavior isn't aligned, we don't get books, we don't get houses, we don't get all of those things that require some alignment of behaviors.
In the article on COVID-19 conspiracies, you mentioned ways in which technology could also be used to identify and maybe to prevent the spread of conspiracy theories. Can you tell me a bit about that?
What we're working on now is both threats and strategies. And so a threat is something that people in that conversation see as being threatening, disruptive. And so if we have an understanding of what those threats or disruptions might be, right? So the virus is not a real virus, it's a hoax. We might then be able to recognize that this could be a problem that will appear in the near future. And particularly if the strategy is something like film your hospital or, don't wear masks or whatever, right? Then you can be prepared for that type of strategy being applied to that type of threat, so that you are in a position to deal with whatever real world action people decide to take based on the storytelling. I'm not particularly optimistic that one can go in and actually engineer the storytelling. These storytelling environments are so complex and consist of so many people, and it may not actually be it might backfire in all sorts of ways. But to be aware that people are not going to be wearing masks, that gives you a lot of information to work with, for example.
The policymakers should not be surprised that without doing any kind of an outreach, people are not wearing masks. And maybe it'll be kind of like, how do you reach out to these people? No silver bullets, no magic.
Yeah, unfortunately, we haven't designed a big red button. Stop that.
This comes to the theory of chaos and chaotic systems, right? A dynamical system, especially when it's on the edge, which is what human systems are, it's always on the edge. Otherwise, your society is not doing enough. All our policies, all our behavior are always keeping us on the verge of kind of either a collapse or a major advancement. So you cannot have a major advancement without having the prospect of the dual outcome that there could be a collapse.